now the next part of our agenda is going to a Mentimeter. And Bram, you will be starting up the Mentimeter for everybody to see, I think. Statement number one is already on the screen. So once you're in the Mentimeter, please respond to this first statement. Current subsidies mostly reinforce bad practices in food systems. Disagree, you press 1. To agree, you press 5, or something in the middle. We see that most of you go towards strongly agree. Sergey, can I ask you to reflect on the outcome that you see here and maybe your own opinion on this statement?
Yeah, I strongly agree with the score. 3.5 out of 5, fair from my point of view. That's how we would also see the current state of affairs. Not all agricultural support is bad or not bringing results. Some of it bringing results and absolutely necessary. But right now, and especially I will talk about it during my presentation, due to many considerations, including the political considerations, or some little understanding on the link between spending and the impact on the ground. There is still, unfortunately, a lot of support which is undermining the food system transformation than supporting it. Over, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sergey. Then let's go to the second statement. Please rate it the same as you just did. So the second statement, also about subsidies, is current subsidies in food systems disturb the market for the private sector. Disagree is 1, agree is 5, or anything in the middle. And I see you have been voting in the middle. Oh, it's fluctuating a lot. Well, in the meantime, maybe Sergey, we can already go to you. And what is your opinion on this statement, your experience with it, and what do you think of the opinion of our audience?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's also right. I would say I would be probably even closer to 4 than to 3.5. The functioning markets are absolutely critical for the efficient outcomes. I think when we go back to the school and during the student years, in the study of economics, probably 70% of our time we spend to understand how markets work. And there is a reason for that, because they're fundamental and critical to ensure outcomes for both consumers, producers, and other stakeholders. And there is a role for private sectors to mitigate and address market failures, especially in developing countries. You have problems with the access to credit, you have market failures related to the access to information, to the access to markets from the infrastructure point of view. And there is indeed a role for the government to play. But in many, many places, sometimes the government is playing the constructive role to help markets to reduce transaction costs and function efficiently. But in many places, the government tried to replace the private sector, saying we can do the job better. In the short run, it can work. In the long run, it always bites. And so I think from the economic and fiscal perspective, 3.5, I would even push a bit further to 4 out of 5. Then right now, a lot of subsidies, especially in developing countries, unfortunately disturb market rather than helping to function market more efficiently. Over, back to you.
Thank you, Sergey. Is there something you think that governments could do in the process of determining the subsidies to avoid and check maybe whether or not it will disturb the private sector?
Absolutely. I think it's important to realize that it's very popular in recent years to talk about the price stabilization and fair prices. And in theory, it's understood. In practice, very difficult to determine what the fair prices are. They could be fair for farmers, but unfair for consumers. Um, Agriculture is always associated with some price volatility. And it's better to have volatile but low prices rather than very stable but high prices for consumers, for example. So there are a lot of, I think the challenge is for many people, and there is political pressure in many countries for the governments to do something. And I think the brave governments don't do anything or they respect markets. And the governments who are looking for the easy solutions um, typically intervene. And again, it works in the short run because it helps to stabilize, it brings some confidence to consumers. But in the long run, it just hurts investors because many markets require long-term investments and stability, not from terms of the how prices are stable, but from the government actions. You know, this discussion of stability, very often people talk about the stable prices, stable exchange rates, but it is not about that. That can be overcome. The private sector, farmers, consumers can react to that instability. The most unstable is government erection, and that need to be really taken carefully and seriously. And I think there is still in many places a lot to do for the governments to help to crowd in private investments rather than crowd them out. Over.
Thank you very much, Sergey. Without further ado, yeah, we go to the third statement, which you now see on your screen. Third statement being governments and donors should avail high risk-bearing capital to support blended finance models needed for food system transformation. So we're saying here that it's mainly governments and donors that should avail high risk-bearing capital with an emphasis also on the high risk bearing capital to support blended finance models, which are needed for food system transformation. So let's go to Bas maybe to react. Bas, could you reflect on what you see in the response trend?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, for sure. And I'm not surprised by the outcome. I think in the general perception in our market, usually there is, when it comes to risk mitigation instruments that are put in place, governments and donors are the first to look at. But to be frank, I believe when it comes to doubling down on blended finance solutions in a given market, Mm, it doesn't really matter what type of player, if you ask me, steps in with sort of securitizing or mitigating the risk for a specific intervention, but it comes down to what type of intervention this is and who is bearing the risk in the end. So if you want to have a consortium approach of private players and public players and civil society working together to have these models in place. For example, if we take some form of guarantee, a first loss guarantee against a specific, a first loss guarantee, for example, that can be carried by organizations like in the African context, the Africa Guarantee Fund or ASELI. Those are usually also have been fundraised against the backdrop of both private and public pockets. So I think the question should be more about what type of risk mitigation instrument should be put in place rather than whose player is responsible for it. Usually, we see that, and alluding back to the statement, is that public organizations receive relatively better concessional capital to put these types of guarantees in place, rather than, for example, a Rabobank, who can also put in the same instrument, but that's against a relatively more expensive cost of funding. If you know what I mean. So that's usually a big leverage factor in which different type of players can come together to come up with these blended finance solutions. So my opinion would be it doesn't matter what type of actor is involved in this because there's many solutions and many players, but it's more about what type of instrument is actually being put in place. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bas. Let's go to the fourth and last statement, which is a sustainable, resilient food system is unattainable without a leading role from the private financial sector, but they are not taking up this role sufficiently at the moment. We are curious to see your opinion on this statement. So there's clearly a role for private financial sector for resilient food systems, but they are not taking up this role sufficiently at the moment. Let's see what your opinion is on that. You strongly agree or you strongly disagree? Bas, would you like to reflect on that?
Yeah. I seem to be the corporate elephant in the room, so I will take my responsibility. Thank you very much. And I believe it's very hard to generalize on this specific statement, right? It depends a lot on a case by case basis and which sector and which value chain. But if we look at it from a real user case perspective, and then, for example, zooming in on things like the cocoa value chain or the coffee value chain, or with the implementation of the EUDR, which I guess most of you are familiar with, that is the European legislation for the against the deforestation that is being put in place, then what we see from the business reality is that organizations across the value chain are not stepping up enough to make the last mile work for the actual producers that are involved in this chain. So from that perspective, I agree with it. I believe that what we see in terms of prices and volatility in the market of cocoa and coffee value chains is that most of the responsibility in the end is being put against at the cost of the income flows of smallholder farmers because margins are becoming tighter, prices are getting higher, negotiation space becomes smaller. And it's not necessarily the, let's say, the private sector that has a disadvantage from that. Because they are in a power position to make their own rules in a certain sense. With EUDR, we see a pattern where it is proclaimed by the European Union that on the individual smallholder level, there should be a registration of what is happening on a plot level. But the key players in the value chain are not always that keen to provide the money and the resource and the capacity for the farmers to comply with it. So I guess we can rather speak of a responsibility gap within certain value chains to make it a bit more precise. But again, it's hard to generalize because I also know very good examples of where it's the other way around. And the private sector does step up in their role to make a change. Thank you.
Bas, can I ask you a follow-up question? What do you think uh, would be necessary, or what would be reasons? How could we incentivize the private financial sector to do this more?
Yeah, I believe that looking at the examples that I know from the field where public-private collaboration is working on an individual level, one of the I would say two factors play a very important role here. First is that instead of fighting the symptoms of a certain problem, both types of organizations have to go back to the drawing table and really understand what are the root causes of a specific problem. So if we're looking at, for example, the cocoa market in West Africa, we have to understand that all players have to come together to, for example, rejuvenate the cocoa trees to increase productivity and yields per acre on the longer term. Now, that requires effort from both cases. So coming back to the point that Sergey was alluding to earlier, and the other question with guaranteeing and risk mitigation measures is that very practically, you can think of terms of an organization like CocoaBot in Ghana that is providing incentives for private players to step in to fund rejuvenation programs for cocoa trees on the long term. So I believe there is a role to play there when it comes to public offerings of guarantees where private sector players can step in. But really making sure that from the outset, the agenda with the end results is very clear. And sometimes I feel, and then also alluding to the subsidy point that we discussed earlier, that sometimes the wrong subsidies are being used for the right purposes or the other way around. And then I think that all has to do with common agenda setting or the lack of common agenda setting. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, interesting question also to maybe have a follow-up discussion about later, is how can co-creation be done, so that some wrong decisions are avoided if it's co-created. That's an interesting point of view as well. But thanks everybody for reacting to the statements, and thank you, Sergey and Bas, for your expert opinion on the statements. We are going to continue with the next part of the webinar.